Okay, welcome to the Monday, May 7th, 2018 work session of the Falls Church City Council. We are delighted to have you all with us this evening. I know there's a lot of things going on, so we have a busy meeting. We're pleased to have our friends from the school board here. Thank you all for coming out. You're welcome to sit at the table as well if you'd like. But Mr. Shields, why don't you go ahead and get started with an update on the campus project?
Thank you, Mayor Tarter, members of council. I'm joined by our consultants from Alvarez and Marcel, and we also are joined in the back by Susan Bell and Carly Albury, and they will all be contributing to tonight's discussion. There are three areas of work tonight relating to the campus project. First, we'd like to discuss with you the down selection process for the proposals that we received from the RFP. We're about to launch that effort. Second, we'd like to discuss with you the request for detailed proposals and the preliminary work that we've done on that. And there's much more work to come over the next month plus, as we review the proposals, get informed by what the market has told us in its initial submissions, and use that along with a lot of community input to draft the RFD piece. So that's the second piece. Then the third piece is to discuss the zoning and entitlements for the site. That discussion is a continuation of a briefing that the council received back in January 16th. And we want to update you on the refinements that we've made to that zoning plan for the campus site. For each of these three areas, we will have a lot of community discussion before final decisions are made. And I would also note that the school board and EDA and the Planning Commission have been informed of tonight's agenda, and I've been in discussion either with Dr. Noonan or with the chair of the Planning Commission and the chair of the EDA, and staff and I will be attending their upcoming meetings to discuss each of these items as well. I'd also note on Sunday, May 20th, we're going to have one of our Sunday series town hall meetings right here in this room at 2 o'clock, again, that Sunday, May 20th, to provide a more full community discussion on each of these items, as well as an update on the school procurement process. So before we jump into these three items, I do think it's worthwhile to pause for just a moment and appreciate the fact that on May 1st, we received 6 responses to the RFP. The firms that have teamed up to prepare a response represent the highest quality, I believe, in the country. And so I think we should pause and say, okay, our process, we're taking good steps. This represents confidence in that process that we've laid out and our commitment to work with the private sector to create a great place and to create value that will help our taxpayers afford a world-class high school. So that's an important first step. And with that first step, we know we've got a lot of work now to do to carry this process forward, and a lot of really, I think, interesting and difficult decisions we'll be making over the coming year. Last week, as part of the preparation that we've been making, we traveled to New York. The Chief Financial Officer, Ms. Bawa, Mayor Tarter, myself, and our financial advisor, David Rose, and Joe Mason with Davenport. The purpose of the trip was to meet with the rating agencies, with Fitch, S&P, and Moody's, which we did. Specifically, this trip was about asking for the ratings, and informing the rating agencies about the $23.1 million that will be issued this coming June. And so we expect ratings on that bond issuance on or about May 14th. But of course, as part of that briefing on that bond issuance, we did lay out our plan of finance for the larger CIP, $145 million of debt that is planned over the next 3 years. And we laid it out. We laid out the strengths of the city's financial condition, and we laid out the referendum results. We laid out the information we presented at the referendum with respect to tax rates, as well as our plans for economic development on 10 acres that we'll be discussing tonight. So that's just one additional step in the hundreds of steps we've been taking to prepare for the effort to come. So again, the three items we'll cover, the down selection process, we're about to launch that. That's a process to take the 6 proposals that we've received, narrow that down to approximately 3 that would go on to the next phase, the detailed phase of this procurement process for the 10 acres. For that process, the request for detailed proposals, we are in the preliminary stages of that. What we'd like to do is have a discussion with you about some of the key features of that RFDP, what it is we want to accomplish with it, and have a discussion about the evaluation process that, or the evaluation criteria that we would include in that RFDP, as well as a discussion about how we will ask for value for the 10 acres. And we'll discuss sort of conceptually how the value allocation tables would be crafted so that the respondents can be evaluated by the city, but provide that information, really understand it and compare the different options that are before us. And lastly, the discussion on zoning and entitlements, and Susan Bell and Carly Aubrey will lead us through that discussion. So let me now turn it over to Ms. Boss, Jen Boss with Alvarez and Marcel to brief you on the evaluation process. I will note we met with the Campus Coordinating Committee Friday, I think 10 days ago, and briefed them on this evaluation process. There is a 3-pager that kind of lays out how that process will work, and that's what we'll walk through with you tonight. And this is what we plan to use with the selection committee as they do go about their work, principally in the month of May. Ms. Boss.
Sure thing. All right, good evening, everyone. We're happy to be here to celebrate the accomplishment that we've already gotten past with getting some really great high-quality bids. We just got our hands on the proposals on Friday afternoon, and it's been great to start to flip through and to acquaint ourselves with them. We feel confident that there are some great ideas there and that the project is on the right track. So the hard part now is figuring out how to differentiate those proposals and to find those that rise above and are worthy of moving on to the request for detailed proposals and those that meet the requirements and goals that the city has outlined. And so to do that, the city has outlined a process that will involve a sizable and qualified and diverse evaluation committee. You can see down on the lower left-hand corner that the evaluation committee is made up of a combination of city staff as well as consultants and representatives from the Economic Development Authority, from the school board, etc. And there will also be a number of advisory members of the evaluation committee to provide input in terms of things like the financial wherewithal of these teams, as well as the legal implications of selecting one or another. We will be kicking off with the evaluation committee on Thursday afternoon, where we'll be presenting this evaluation plan, providing copies of the proposals, as well as providing the evaluation template that everyone will be using collectively. And following that kickoff, everyone will take the proposals and their template and fill it out to the best of their abilities based on some of the skills that they have. If there's a certain section that they don't feel like they are equipped to respond to, then they're welcome to leave those sections blank. But the idea is that everyone can come together at an evaluation workshop on the 29th and bring their ratings and rankings of those bidders so that we can come to some sort of a consensus based on the conversations in that room. We anticipate that at the kickoff, individuals will express an interest in one or more specific aspects of the proposals based on their areas of expertise and may go off and even do some of their own due diligence beyond what we see on that page. And we would welcome that the same way that we'll be doing additional work on our end to dig into things like financial statements and to qualify their financial capability. In terms of the split of duties, the evaluation committee has committed to attending several of these sessions that I've mentioned, the kickoff as well as that workshop, to going back and reviewing things like the compliance check that we'll be conducting over the next few days leading up to that Thursday session. And our duties will be to compile the ratings and rankings that each of those committee members devise, bringing together a summary that contains their ratings and their concepts and their strengths and weaknesses, as well as the things that we see in our baseline evaluation. We would like to bring some of the third-party expertise that we have in other transactions like this around the region and around the country, and we'll be bringing that feedback as well as compiling what we see from the committee to that work session. In terms of the way that the proposals will be evaluated, we have several different dimensions. The first is a compliance check, and you can see, skipping ahead to the third page of the document, which of those evaluation factors are more compliance-based, a simple yes-no, or maybe not such a simple yes-no. We may need to dig in and look at some of the nuances, but at the end of the day, it won't be evaluated on a spectrum. We'll be looking to see if they have complied with the requirement or not, versus those that would be rated based on a color system, looking at features that are exceptional or acceptable all the way down to unacceptable. The other dimension beyond the compliance check and those color ratings, and recording qualitatively what some of the significant strengths and weaknesses are, is a risk rating. And for each of the sub-factors, and all of those sub-factors were defined in the RFP, so none of them should be a surprise to the bidders. For each of those sub-factors, we'll have a risk rating as well that evaluates any risk that we see in their ability to execute on what we've read in the proposal. So for instance, if someone says, yes, I'm going to build 1 million square feet of office at the site, they might get a great color ranking because we're looking for lots of commercial development. But we know, based on market studies, that it might be difficult to bring that much commercial development, certainly in something like a single phase. And so they would get a high risk rating. We want to make sure that we're finding ways to differentiate those areas that we've defined as exceptional. If we flip again to that third page, you can see that we've got 4 basic factors in the evaluation criteria, ranging from qualifications and experience to financial capability, the approach that they've taken to the project and the designs and initial conceptual site plans that they've provided, and then finally on to their high-level financial approach. It's important to note that at this stage, we have not requested detailed financial plans nor pro formas, because the goal of this solicitation was primarily qualification and getting a basic sense of the conceptual design that they would bring to the site, not so much digging into exactly how many square feet of this they would have or what value that generates to the city. It's those down-selected teams that will be responding to the RFDP that will provide that level of detail. Finally, for each of those factors, we have a list of sub-factors, because we want to look at this on a granular level and not keep it so high level at just the factors. And as I mentioned before, each of those sub-factors are broken down into those things that are more compliance-based. You've either met the requirements that were outlined in the RFP, such as the financial capability of the firm, having all of the right teaming components, bringing a project approach that has the narratives and the designs that we've requested, versus those things that are more evaluative, such as the level of qualification of the professionals, the amount of experience that they have with similar scaled and scoped projects, etc. Are there any questions on the evaluation plan and the approach that we're taking to that?
One of the things that we'll just note a lot for the city council rep is between now and Thursday, there might be some that representative would be.
Okay, any questions? Vice Mayor Connolly?
Mr. Shields, this evaluation committee, when it's assembled, will it also be the RFDP evaluation committee, or will that be a different group?
It can be a different group.
Okay, so we're not setting in stone both with
No, that's
doing
not
this one?
necessarily-
Okay.
Ms. Hardy?
Great. Thank you, Jen. It's really robust. It's the first time we've seen it, so I think it might take us a while to digest it, but a couple quick questions. On the third page, is that least to most important from left to right or vice versa?
So they do range from some of the more important things to those that are less important.
Okay, so most to least. Got it. What do you all envision the city council role after this group presents a recommendation? Do we gonna get to understand the rationale that went behind the recommendation, or are we supposed to just take the recommendation? Like, how does that work?
Well, I think our goal would be to provide a recommendation and the basis for that recommendation. And then, if the council wishes, all the information you need to understand that recommendation, we'll provide you.
Are we privy to anything? So I know that there might be things that might get excluded if there's confidential or competitive information. Will council have access to that, or are we going to have the same level of access as the general public outside of the evaluation committee?
So the evaluation committee, one of the things the members of the evaluation committee will need to do is sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, to view the confidential material. Let me look to the city attorney. Would the city council then sign that NDA as well for any of the, access to any of the confidential information?
I think that's right. Anyone who wanted to look at the confidential information would need to sign the non-disclosure agreement.
So as long as we sign one, then we could get access to whatever's. Got it. Thank you.
Mr. Lichtenhouse and Mr. Snyder?
So just to be clear, this evaluation committee, when you have the voting provision here of yes, are we saying that this evaluation committee will be the final vote on how we down select before we go to RFDP?
No,
Or is-
the city council will be the
Okay.
decision maker. This group is advisory to the city council.
Okay, so what's the voting? Just voting to agree on what you present to city council?
That's the process so that the evaluation committee reaches consensus in a clear way, that it's
Got
not
it.
sort of a vague, we thought we landed here, but we,
Got
it's
it.
meant to make it clear where the recommendation is.
Mr. Snyder?
Thank you. So what I'm hearing is that once we sign the non-disclosure agreement, city council members have access to all the documents. Is that right? And then do we input to our representative on this group, or does this group go off and do its thing, and then we're looking at it on a parallel track? I'm trying to figure out what the role is of the non-group council members.
Well, the council members can read the proposals and come to their own conclusions. I think there is the expectation that there'd be a certain amount of trust that this group is going through a rigorous process to understand the proposals fully from multiple perspectives and multiple dimensions, and to provide you with the best recommendation. At the end of the day, the council is the final decider.
So this group would go off, and then we'd be presented with this. And how much time would we have to discuss it publicly and privately? Because this is a critical decision, and all the council needs to make it, which we're making technically, but I'm not sure we're making it as a matter of reality. So and this doesn't need to be answered tonight, but I think we need to somehow figure out what the role of the council members are that are not on this group. The second point I want to make is when I'm looking at these factors in order of importance, I don't see anything about commercial. I see mixed-use development, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that, but the whole thing here was, it seems to me, that you get some people in who know how to get businesses here. So am I missing that, or it would be okay if you said commercial / mixed-use development, but I just don't, potentially someone could come in with something that's 99% residential. And I can't see how that would meet our financial objectives.
No, that's very understandable. I think that the commercial piece gets subsumed into the one under project approach, where we say the project concepts alignment with project requirements. Because in the RFP, we've outlined a requirement to have a substantial amount of commercial development on the site. So that's where that would be accounted for. And the way that those requirements would be analyzed by the evaluation committee would largely be founded in the concept that there would be a decent amount of quality commercial development at the site.
I would be more comfortable if we made that somehow more precise here. You don't, again, from my standpoint, we don't need to engage in editing tonight, but I would like something that signals we're really looking, whatever else we may get here, we're looking at something with some serious commercial background. Another point here on risk. Are we taking into account how they would structure the whole financial arrangement?
Yes. The financial approach section, the fourth one on the factor list, is all about how they would structure it. Now, in the RFP, we've outlined a preferred transaction structure that contains the provision for an initial payment, that talks about the preference for having a substantial payment then at the transfer of land 2 years later after the high school is constructed. So we've outlined a preferred structure already, but then asked them for alternatives as well, and for their responses to that proposed transaction structure. And so that financial approach on the right side of the page is all about evaluating their approach to what we have suggested as the preferred structure, but also finding ways to look at any alternatives that they would bring to the table.
Okay, and one other thing, financial risks. Part of the issue is not just the finances that the corporate group may have, but how would they structure this transaction? Because they could structure the transaction to seal themselves off from a lot of risk, and thereby shifting it all to the city. So that structuring is something I think we learned from prior experience with this is really important in terms of the risk analysis.
We agree completely. In fact, that last one that you see, that sub-factor on the bottom right there, the ability to anticipate and mitigate risk, and their approach to any kind of schedule defaults, because that schedule default will impact the city. That's what we're getting at with that one. And we approach all of the projects that we work on from the perspective of limiting risk to the amount possible to the government or institutional client. And that's certainly how we would approach this one as well. We want to limit your risk as much as possible. Part of our strategic roadmap outlined a list of potential risks and ways that we were attempting to mitigate them, in part through this procurement process, in part through things that would happen during the structuring process as well. So that is definitely top of mind for us, and we would be approaching the structure that they bring to the table, as well as the response to the one that we brought, from a risk mitigation perspective.
We're also really versed, having done this process for a lot of institutional and municipal clients. We see all the tricks, subordination of expenses to achieve artificial debt coverage ratios, planned refinances to hit, material internal rates of return. We see that stuff, and we're very highly attuned to it, and we'll be able to pick those types of risky approaches, achieve returns, able to grade them, and judge their risk accordingly.
Additionally, as we get into the RFDP phase and we get to dig into their financials more completely, we'll be looking at the assumptions that they use to underwrite the value that they're proposing to the city to make sure that they're reasonable. We wouldn't want them to come back with astronomically high rent rates, for instance, so that they could, on paper, demonstrate a high value of the land to the city, and then later on down the line, they would come back and say, actually, market rents are not that high, so thus we're going to take value down. So we'll be looking at all of those individual assumptions and verifying that they are market feasible, and that the project that they're proposing from a market perspective and the value that they're suggesting that can come to the city is reasonable as well.
Thank you.
on the topic of risk, one of the things that I feel like is lost from this document, and I don't want to lose sight of it, especially in light of what our neighbors are doing next to the Metro stop. One area of risk for us, obviously, is the development that WMATA has put forth, whether you consider it a placeholder or it's moving aggressively. But it's also an area of opportunity, and one of the things that I keep top of mind when looking at and evaluating the credentials and the credibility of the individuals that are bidding on this project is their ability to corral a neighboring jurisdiction as well as grab the ear of WMATA. And not to say that you could perfectly partner on a larger kind of master plan development, but at least be cognizant of phasing. And to some degree, the city can do its part, but to a larger degree, we are really going to have to leverage what I would consider the relationships as well as the chops, so to speak, of the developers to be able to bring WMATA into the conversation as needed, if there's the opportunity. So again, it's a risk for us, obviously, that I'm sure you guys are well aware of because it takes into consideration market absorption and what's happening down the road, but it's also a huge opportunity for us. I want to make sure that that's not lost, that we're not evaluating these initial 6 applicants in a vacuum, really only inside the bubble of this 10.3 acre development, that there's that kind of larger opportunity and risk being considered in terms of their ability to contemplate that as part of a larger development.
Just going to quickly add that it's also being able to work with Fairfax County, so I think that's probably kind of covered in your qualifications, so not only WMATA, but also being able to partner well with other jurisdictions, Federal Realty across the street, and I think that goes to their qualifications, like if they have the ability to do that is important.
Mr. Z?
Thank you, Mayor. I can see that we're already launching into key points on the RFDP. I'd like to return to this process first. What is if you could just explain the role of Alvarez Marsal. I see, a listing of 5 key points here on things you would do. They're both substantive things as well as things that say, well, we're just going to be available for advice. So my question is it emphasized that you would be available to answer questions for the evaluators severally, or is it just a jointly kind of deal that we're talking about?
What we've proposed on the paper here is that we would be there for the 2 sessions to answer questions jointly. Obviously, if folks had questions and wanted to reach out individually and that was acceptable to the city, we're open, our phones are always there, we're always going to answer them. If there's a technical question that we can help them work through as they're trying to figure out how someone stacks up against someone else or against the evaluation criteria, we're certainly open to that. We wouldn't want to get into a situation where, we're giving different advice to different people, so we'd want to be very careful of that, which is one of the reasons why it's nice to have people hearing the same message in the same room. But we're certainly open to talking to folks.
Yeah, that's kind of why I asked that question, and it may be a better question for the city manager and or legal counsel here, because we may not just have the resources to do it. I would expect that if you're answering a question for an individual that has general import, that you would capture that and then put that out to everybody as well on your answer. And if there's money to do that, then that's certainly one venue that could be explored. Is it also the thinking that the evaluators would not be able to confer with each other prior to the meetings, or in the Competition Virginia Act, there's certain things we have to follow, but this is a little bit different.
I think for maybe both questions, I think the intent is that each of the members of the team go off and work independently and do their own thinking, do their own reading, and then come back together in late May and then work through a process where we'll have professional advice, but also everybody coming to the table with having done their homework and come to their own conclusions, but also coming to the table open-minded and ready to learn from other members of the team, and at the end, reaching consensus on the 3 best of the 6.
Okay, and,
So whether there be a firm, no, I'm not familiar with a rule that says thou shalt not speak to other members, like jury instructions or something like that.
maybe thou shalt try not to speak, but if you do, you don't tell anybody about it.
But I think we'll try to articulate what the spirit of this, what this work assignment is.
All right, and going to risk, this, it looks qualitative as well. So, it's again, a stoplight kind of determination, right? And so I would assume then that you would have a factual basis, not necessarily weighted, that would say this is high risk or this is medium risk in certain areas. Well, that's what makes this fun, I guess. Thank you.
So I've got just a quick question following up on what Mr. Snyder had talked about. So when council evaluates, does the final evaluation of this, I suppose there's going to be confidential information that's going to be part of that discussion. Is it anticipated that we'll have a closed session of some kind to do kind of a council evaluation, maybe in connection with also an open meeting? But is that your thought?
I think it's certainly available to the council to do that. And I think maybe we'd cross that bridge when we get to it. If there's a desire to discuss the parts of the proposals that are confidential, then that would be something we would need to go into closed session to do. If there's not a need to have that discussion, then we could avoid that.
Yeah, I'm sure we'd all like to have as much in public as possible, but I'm just sort of thinking ahead a little bit. Okay. I had another question. I was just listening to the kid out there. I was trying to think what the other. I think I've lost the thought for the moment.
My job to derail you.
Okay. Anyway, I guess that's all I've. All right, go ahead.
So during May 11th and May 28th, when everyone's reviewing the proposals, do we envision any interaction with the bidders? Like, if we have follow-up questions, are we allowed to get more information, or is we supposed to evaluate just based on the bids submitted?
Sure. So we have already gone back through Jim Wise and through the purchasing office to the bidders that had some compliance issues, and they've already responded and provided any missing information, which is why we've been able to move forward with all 6 of the bidders who initially responded. In terms of follow-up questions, I think that's going to depend a bit on what we find in the proposals. If there's something seriously lacking, we may want to ask a question, though it does open up a can of worms in terms of the timing. Allowing a detailed Q&A period back and forth could derail the schedule that we have here. So unless we find something that causes serious pause, I think that we would likely tend to stay away from that path. So it's going to be a little bit iterative. It's not something that's been defined and set in stone in this document.
So, Mr. Shields, could you outline a little bit as well how we're going to make information available to the public? Like, in other words, would we anticipate disclosing the public portions of these proposals that have been received, and sort of how the public will be involved?
And I might invite Ms. McCoskey to speak to this as well, but there is a process we'll go through where we'll review all the portions of the proposals that they've marked confidential. And if we have some disagreement with that or want to have some conversations with them about that, we need to do that between now and, I think, May 10th.
It's within 10 days after the submission.
So we have 10 days to do that confidentiality check, and the intention is that no later than, well, by the Virginia Procurement Act, no later than 10 days after receipt of them, we will be posting the proposals on the city webpage.
So would that be Friday?
What exactly?
I think that it may be the 10th. Yeah.
Coming up quick.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so possibly later this
third-
week.
Yeah. And the public portions would be posted online, and the public could look at them then.
Okay. Mr. Lichtenhouse?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just having some heartburn over this process. I just want some clarity because I'm going to have a very difficult time sitting down and voting based on information. I mean, I appreciate what the evaluation committee is going to provide, the questions, the discussions that are going to take place, but assuming if I'm not someone on the evaluation committee, I'm going to want to have every single opportunity to ask whatever questions that I need to ask, evaluating every single one of those proposals before making any kind of vote. So I want to feel 100% comfortable. So I want to make sure that we have the opportunity to do that. If it's NDAs that have to be signed, if it's an evaluation committee work session that's open to council members, however, we need to get access to the information that we need, because I will not feel comfortable casting a vote on what is probably one of the single biggest decisions the city make over the next 50 years without having access to all of that information. And I just don't want it all to be filtered through an evaluation committee. Again, I appreciate the efforts, but just my own conscience being able to vote on this and feeling comfortable doing it, I want to make sure that we have that process available, because I don't want to end up it being presented and then I feel that I'm about 60% good with the information that I've been provided, but there's a lot of outstanding questions, and we're forced because of a timeline and a process to vote on something that we don't feel completely educated, informed, and ready to vote on.
There'll be the opportunity. We're going to make sure you have your questions answered. We do, I will say that I think this process is going to work fairly well, and that as we go through the steps of it, that confidence will grow as we get into mid-June, when council will be asked to make that decision.
Other comments? Okay. So, Mr. Snyder?
Again, I think Ross and I share the same issue, so I think we need more than we'll like the process when we see it. So if you can be more specific about how we get information, when we get information, and things like that, because it is, as Councilmember Lichtenhouse said, it's about the most important decision we've made in a while.
Let me just ask a question here, because you have laid out the process, and it's a process that many of those that have taken part in evaluation and selection and recommendation are familiar with. Those that aren't, you need to do it a couple times before you become comfortable with the process. So is it possible to hand out the evaluation sheet to those people that actually want to get hands-on this, and even though they don't even have an advisory role, but would ultimately arguably be part of the determinant? So if the council decides, and the council members like Mr. Snyder, Mr. Lichtenhouse want to go through their own dry run, they're perfectly welcome to do so. I don't see a embargo against that per se.
I guess phrased differently, when can we sign the NDA? Because that seems to be the angst, right? Like, people want access to it. Some people may spend more time on it, but I think if we all sign the NDA, then we should be able to have as much time as the evaluation committee, right?
I think we should probably shoot towards Thursday for that, to allow that confidentiality check to be completed. And we'll, that's when the evaluation committee would kick off, and so I think that'd be an appropriate.
Mr. Shields, how many council, quote, meetings on this were you anticipating?
Well, we can use every meeting between now and mid-June to provide updates on the process. We've got work to do on the RFDP, and the council will be engaged in that. I think probably council members will be spending their own time reading through the proposals as well, and then getting the report from the evaluation committee. So I think at every meeting between now and then, we'll have an update, or we'll schedule as needed to keep council involved in it.
I mean, I assumed we'd be doing that, but I'm talking about the evaluation portion of it. So if it was contemplated, we'd all get together and sort of roll through it in one meeting. I think that's probably not going to be what's going to happen. And so I think we need to plan a couple meetings for us to be getting together to talk about this, either whether it needs to be closed session, open session, as much of this open session as possible. But I think we probably need to plan a couple weeks for that kind of evaluation by council.
Well, be kind of stark about it, we have this evaluation committee. Does the council wish to be the evaluation committee? That would be not the normal process. But, I'm hearing, I'm hearing some anxiety here. Let's just say that, let's get the recommendation from the evaluation committee. You'll have had a chance to read the proposals. You'll either see whether you agree with the recommendations, in which case that will be fine. If there are points of disagreement, then we'll just work through those. I don't think we have to try to envision every twist and turn of the process. What we've laid out here is a pretty normal and a pretty solid process.
Well, I think just by timing, if we want to meet our deadlines, I think we need to back in a little bit, maybe a little extra time for that. That's what I'm hearing right now. Okay, any other thoughts on this portion of the conversation? We haven't had much discussion on, or any discussion on who the person would be on this committee, and we can have some of that discussion now, or people can, for example, send me their thoughts, or the vice mayor and I their thoughts, and we can try to kind of work through that over the next couple days. So maybe that's what we'll do then. If anyone has any thoughts on the person or persons who would be involved in this on the evaluation committee, why don't you send them maybe to Vice Mayor and myself, and we can have those conversations. Of course.
There had also been some conversation about having 2 council reps on this committee. You only have 1 listed here. I don't have a strong feeling one way or the other. I just want to make sure that gets out there that somewhere along the line.
I just might suggest that whatever meetings are being held and the information that's being presented to this evaluation committee is open to the rest of council. I mean, that may allay a lot of the concerns. They don't have to vote per se on the recommendation, but at least be privy to the conversations that are being had, because it sounds to me like there will be some conversations that we'll have as council where there'll be certain pieces of information that can't be disclosed in a public setting, some which may only be able to happen during the evaluation committee meetings. So if you have access to that information as council who ultimately votes, that may allay some of those concerns. Just a suggestion.
Well, I would say I'd want the city attorney to make sure that that doesn't violate any procurement rules, or, we need to make sure that we're doing all this above board.
Well, what we'll need to do is to, when we get to the point of council discussions, clearly when we have either briefings or an opportunity for you to ask questions or have discussions, and there are matters that involve confidential information or information that's determined to be confidential in the proposals, that will have to be done in a closed session, and we can discuss that part in closed session. And then there is a good amount, or should be a good amount of the proposals that are public. That'll be the public parts that have been announced, and that could be discussed in an open session. But I think, without prejudging where we're going to get to at some point, I think it is likely that we're going to have some closed sessions to talk about, especially a lot of the financial information.
Okay. Ms. Hardy?
So I like Ross's suggestion of letting council sit in on those evaluation committee meetings. Is there a legal problem with that?
I'll need to double check. I don't think so. It may be that what we want to do is set it up so it's just the committee participating, but others could sit in, but I'll need to double check that.
It sounds like the information access is the same, whether you're on the advisory or evaluation committee or council, but I think it's just more being privy to the discussion and having that color in there. Thank you.
I understand. Okay.
Okay, is there any more conversation to be had on this particular item, or should we move on to the next portion of our meeting?
No, we just asked the city manager or city attorney to send out the NDAs tomorrow for execution to council.
What we had indicated was Thursday would be the target date for that.
Okay. Unless there's anything else on this item, why don't we move on to the next portion of the conversation?
Okay, so we'll now transition to the second item, which is the draft of the request for detailed proposals. And I'll just make a few points of that and then turn this over to Alvarez and Marcel again. But for the development of the RFDP, we are using the March 1 RFP as the starting point for that document. So its basic structure will be familiar to you and will be familiar to the community. That RFP really sets the organization and the key features for the RFDP as well. So the task with the RFDP is to refine that RFP with more specificity as appropriate for what the city wants. And importantly, we want to read the 6 proposals we've received and have them inform some aspects of the RFDP as well. This is something that was planned in the roadmap from the beginning. So, sorry. So some of the keys, as with the RFP, some of the key sections of the RFDP will be Section 2, where it lists the required and desired elements. Section 4, which will contain the submission requirements, and Section 5, which would contain the evaluation criteria. So at your desk is a copy of the first draft of Section 5, which would be the evaluation criteria. Another key part of the RFDP will be Section 4, which we'll speak to tonight. Section 4, which will be very different from the RFP, will include forms that will ask the firms to fill out, which will set forth the offers for the land. And we'll ask for them both as a lease and a fee simple structure, and we'll ask for values to be assigned on the various uses. We have drafts of these forms prepared, but this is one area in particular where we believe that reading through the responses will help inform these value allocation tables, and we've got some more internal work before we think it would be appropriate to get those out. We do have about approximately a month of work on the RFDP. Again, there's two really critical audiences for this. One obviously is our community, because this is where we're saying what we want, but also, I think very importantly, the development community, the 6 proposers. I think they'll be watching us as we develop the RFP, and so we want to do so in a fairly organized way where we're bringing documents out that have been thought through. So that work is ongoing. So the evaluation criteria, this is just a first crack at it, and let me turn it over to Ms. Boss for a discussion of what we try to accomplish in that section, and then we'll have a discussion sort of on the concept of the allocation tables, and Mr. Risher will lead us through that discussion.
So, as I mentioned before, the major differentiation between the RFP and the request for detailed proposals that we're now preparing is that we'll be diving further into their financial proposals and to the value that they're offering to the city. The way that they can come up with those values, however, is by taking a much closer look at the development programs that at this stage are just in a conceptual state. And so what we'll be looking for in this request for detailed proposals is a finer grain version of their development program, full pro formas where they demonstrate the assumptions that they've used to define the value that they believe the city can extract from the land and other tax revenue bases. And as such, there are 3 key areas that we're focused on for the evaluation factors. The first one, which we've expressed from the very beginning to the development community, is the value that this project can generate for the city. And Ted's going to talk in more detail about that, not just through those land allocation tables, but also the other ways that we'll be looking at value. The other 2 components are the development program, ensuring that we have not just commercial uses, but high quality commercial uses and enough of them. We're looking for a development program that contains the placemaking aspects that we're all seeking, including a sufficient amount of civic space and possibly programming for that space. There has been a desire for some sort of cohesive urban design, as this is a premier project and adjacent to the metro, and as you so eloquently stated, close to the future WMATA development. So we want to make sure that this is a special place that's developed. It's not just a couple of boxes that go up on a corner there next to the new high school. Because there has been such a strong discussion about having a hotel use, while it's not a deal breaker necessarily, we will be evaluating whether or not there is a hotel at the site and what sort of meeting space that hotel has, because that's been one of the primary criteria to help draw people into the city from around the region. Sticking with the affordable housing component that was outlined in the RFP. We'll be looking to make sure that they've complied with the 6% of residential space at 60% of area median income, and that they have physically interacted well with the school site and brought the sustainability features that this body defined as so important to this project. The last piece in the development program that we're going to be digging into is the transportation plan. And this is a critical one, not just because we want the site internally to function well, but because there has to be circulation integration with the school as well as with Route 7. And as we know, there are some concerns on the VDOT side about how this project interacts with Route 7. So we're going to be looking carefully to make sure that they have a well thought out plan that makes sense. So those are some of the areas that we're going to be digging into for the development program. And to get there, we'll be asking for lots of detail about the uses and their placement. We'll be asking for things like renderings to help us evaluate that. The last piece that I'll mention before turning it back to Ted to go over the value is project execution. You know, it's wonderful to get proposals on paper that say we're going to deliver an excellent project in a short period of time that will generate value for the city. But one of our primary concerns is ensuring that it is an executable project. And some of the ways that we would do that is by evaluating whether or not they have a reasonable timeline, recognizing some of the entitlement concerns, recognizing the state of the market and things like phasing, as compared to the assumptions that they're underwriting with. On the topic of phasing, you know, we'll be looking at how they're bringing in different uses. You know, one of the city's primary concerns has been to generate additional tax revenue, and the best way to do that is by bringing in more substantial commercial uses. So we'll be looking to see the order in which they bring their different phases. Do they just start with a residential phase that doesn't necessarily meet the city's goals, or do they start with a mix of, say, commercial and residential that creates a place and also addresses your desire for commercial uses? You know, commitment of capital, and specifically the capital required for pre-development activities like the site work that has to happen. Some of the infrastructure work is another area that we'll be looking at to make sure that the project can be executed, and the structure of their financing plan, as well as the exceptions to the exclusive rights agreement that we will provide as part of the request for detailed proposals. So, you know, development plan and then whether or not they can execute it are two key components. But at this point, by far, the most important thing is making sure that we're extracting value from this project that the city can use to pay down that debt service on the new school. So I'll turn it over to Ted so that he can talk about the components here, as well as some of the value allocation tables that we'll be using to request this information.
So I'll just summarize very briefly 5.1 and what the analysts and I will look at with regard to each submission on the RFDP. Obviously, value is one of the primary focus areas that we're going to deal with, and has to integrate well with not only the economic development goals, but also the physical site and design facets of the development to make sure that you know, taken as a whole, it's the project we want. The first is obviously land compensation. That's the upfront compensation, which is a combination of whatever payment we think is appropriate and market relatable at closing of the equal rights, at the exclusive rights agreement. Thank you. And then followed by the balance, the transfer of the balance of the site value at actual physical conveyance and at execution of the ground lease. So those two payments and also subsequent payments could possibly include annualized ground rent payments. That's never been a subject area we've entertained, but we want to make sure the city had as much information as possible about the different ways the value for the site could be adjudicated to the city. So as we get into the conversation about how we're looking at value, we'll talk about that further. Number two was obviously the other great component of value to the city, which is the generation of future tax revenue. We'll be looking at all these, including the upfront payments, both on a nominal basis and a net present value basis. We'll also discuss with the selection committee and obviously with council why on an NPV basis we may use one discount rate versus another because of what we feel are appropriate risk adjustments in looking at that income. For number 3, the reasonableness of all the development and financing assumptions. We'll go through the pro formas in depth and in detail to look at every assumption, including the financial structuring, the amount of leverage, the reasonableness of the rents and expenses. We want to be conservative, but not deathly conservative. We want to make sure that what the proposer is proposing is achievable, even with maybe some depression in the market in future out years. We want to make sure that the plan is aggressive, but not unrealistic. Certainly with the financial viability and experience of these bidders, we'll be willing to take their word on things, but we're also going to make sure that what they're proposing is reasonable. Number 4, we have indicated in documents and discussions so far a desire to hold the fee title to the land. However, we want to make sure that we have as much information as possible about how certain bidders view that value. Some bidders may overvalue, in our view, having fee simple title, and regardless of that philosophical difference, we want the City Council and the Selection Committee to have that information when they make their vote. And again, we'll get into that in more detail when we discuss value. Then finally, we want to have some specific thoughts and some specific budget numbers associated with the development of the necessary infrastructure on site, not only sort of land development, but also utilities upgrades and anything else downstream that might be a responsibility or partially a responsibility of the development site. We have some very good recent market intelligence on what those types of larger land development deals take in terms of per gross square foot of vertical development or per acre or what have you. And what we'll do is use our own to come up with a reasonable range for what those budget assumptions should be. And really all we're doing there is trying to make sure that their assumptions are reasonable, given all the data we have about the site as well. So those are just a few of the things we're going to look at and evaluate with regard to the responses to the RFD. As I said, some of those value discussions we can have when we get to that.
Okay. Anything else, Mr. Shields? Or we open it up for questions and comments?
I'd be happy to have questions or comments.
It sounded like you guys focused mostly on the evaluation of the RFDP, not the actual content of the RFDP. I mean, I guess, are you sort of getting into, in a roundabout way, the actual content? The RFDP is going to address all these things by asking a question, and then you'll evaluate them as you just described? Okay. Questions, comments? Ms. Hardy?
So question on the draft process. I know that we're going to issue this in June. Are we going to review the actual draft of it between now and June, or how do we get kind of community input, various boards and commissions, et cetera?
We're working on the draft right now, and I think our evaluation of the draft for this meeting was that there was a lot of pretty core things that we wanted to think through more before we got it out to the public and possibly cause confusion. And so I think we're going to continue to focus on it. Our goal is to get it out well in advance so that you have time to really digest it and think about it, ask questions about it, and the public does as well. So, with RFP, I think that was about 30 days in advance of issuance.
So we envision a future work session where we'll get a copy of it in advance and be able to work through red lines. And then the second question is less about the content of the RFDP and more about, as we get to down selecting the 3 or however many commercial bidders we have, the interaction between the school bidder, because at that point the schools will have down selected, and so we'll have kind of interaction between the 1 school bidder potentially with the 3. And I think we talked about it in the campus coordinating committee 10 days ago, but I think that interaction will need to be more explicit and important, I think, because it's not just physically interconnections between project and school site, but together the two sites have to make sense. So whether it's a field or just interaction or the uses among them, I think needing to build that in the process somehow when we down select, issue the RFDP to those three people, making sure it's explicit request that they actually have that interaction with the down selected or the final school bidder, I think, or the owner's agent, whatever we decide.
Agree.
So this is a comment I made at the campus, I think I made at the campus coordinating committee, which is that I think we need to have a request in the RFDP that allows for a breakdown of value so that we can put pieces together. Some things may go up, some things may go down, and we don't want to retrade this with a bidder when they're the only bidder, when we've down selected to one. And so I think we need to lock in per square foot or per hotel key or something, maybe with collars as well. Like there's an assumption there'll be a minimum of a blank of X square feet of this, but maybe no more than X of that, so that we have some general parameters going into our final negotiations, because I imagine the uses may change somewhat, the amounts may change somewhat. Excuse me? It's already in there?
Yeah, it's in there, and we'll get to it.
Okay, is that for later tonight?
It's-
Okay,
well,
I didn't,
It's not in any of the documents that are before you, but do you want to speak to it now since?
I want to allow questions on before, but I can speak to it now, and basically, based partially on your advice from the coordinating committee, but also past experience, what we've done is laid out some draft tables, which you'll see in the draft RFDP when you get it, which basically asks for those different values allocated over the different product types. The initial payment due to each product, the balance of the payment due to each product, the total value, and then breakdown by each product, not only by gross square foot, but also by net square foot, also in the case of the hotel per unit. And this is something we can really sort of infer from the pricing on the hotel, but key prices for the hotel, price per unit, for different unit for the multifamily, price for condos if condos are being proposed as well. So we're asking for a very robust breakdown, and we're asking them to fill it out so that the understanding being that if we do enter into any sort of renegotiation on the program, that these will be the prices we will be negotiating with.
yeah, I think that's important, because when we select from 3 to 1, we want to know the program may change, and probably will change as we go through the entitlement process. We work with the community, and we don't want to be retraded towards the end. I think also not just a per square foot or whatever it is, per unit basis, but also if there are any collar parameters. In other words, we need a minimum of blank number of units. We don't want to do, because you start pushing it down and somebody wants a minimum of X number of units, and we may not want them to have more than the other side of it. And so I think the idea of some kind of ranges or collars on it is probably a discussion we ought to have at some point as well. I got one more comment as well. So when are we anticipating, is it October? I don't have maybe it's here somewhere, that we're anticipating kind of coming down to 1, is that right? And one thing I think we ought to be considering as well is Amazon, and if something happens to Amazon, if that we want to have that as a wild card in here, because I think value will change. If Amazon were to come to Northern Virginia, I think the value of our property will go up. I don't know how much it'll go up, but I think it'll go up some. And so I think that's something to keep in mind as well. I'm not sure how exactly to address it, but I think we want to keep that in the back of our minds. Other comments, Vice Mayor Connolly, do you have a comment?
This is just a question related to what Mayor Tarter was asking, and that is if we're asking the bidders to value all their elements in this worksheet that you're talking about, and one bidder says their condos are going to be worth $10,000 a piece, and another bidder says $5,000 a piece, how are we comparing apples to apples there? Or is there a standard that we put in there that you say actually is the best valuation?
I hope the land pricing for their condos is much higher than that, first of all.
Right.
What we're looking for is, and we don't anticipate there's going to be wild swings in between the different products. In the aggregate, we think there could be some significant differences, but certainly if we're looking at, say, a full-service hotel, there's probably an established band of pricing, of land pricing, for the right to develop those hotel rooms. if we did see a huge variance in between one developer's proposal versus another, then we'd investigate that further and trying to determine what's producing that variance and whether it's due to a change in class of service or whether or not there's some programmatic issues at play. But we don't anticipate huge variances on a product-by-product basis as much as we assume there will be significant differences in the aggregate values proposed. And really, the purpose behind getting them to fill that out too is to get them to commit to that pricing so that it wasn't us telling them, this is what you propose per square foot of multifamily or office space. This is what you proposed. That's part of the reason as well.
Mr. Duncan?
Thank you. It may be premature to speak to this, but since when you were talking about the affordable housing component, you did cite, the 6% standard that we have now. I did want to take this opportunity to say that those of you involved in the down select process and in the drafting of the RFDP, I hope you'll take into consideration this is a generational opportunity to do more in the area of affordable and workforce housing than has been our typical norm here, whether it's units or cash in lieu of units. I think we're talking about multiple hundreds of residential units up on that site. And, if a handful of dozens of affordable or workforce housing units in that multiple hundreds is, to me, I'll just say that my vote would be influenced significantly by a bidder who came to us with some approach that enabled us to move the needle more significantly than we've been able to move it in the area of affordable housing. So if that can be, conveyed now by me, I'll do it. In the down select and in the RFDP language, obviously the market's going to give us exactly what we asked for in that area. Nobody's going to do more out of the goodness of their heart. And I understand that there are trade-offs. If we get more in that area, maybe we get less in others, but at least this member is interested in pushing the envelope as much as we can on the affordable and workforce housing component of the matter that we're considering. Thank you.
Mr. Lichtenhouse?
So one of the issues that I've seen in evaluating other development plans, especially as it relates to local tax revenue for the city, are inconsistencies in the assumptions associated with the calculation against the product type, as well as all the direct and indirect taxes that are generated. So I would imagine, in addition to looking at the breakdown of value by unit type, we'd also like to see an apples-to-apples comparison to make sure that there is a consistent application of assumptions on the tax revenue associated with the different product type. Are you guys going to be providing that reconciliation to say, okay, these guys were using 3% growth rate on assessed value for office, we think it might be 2.5%, to make sure that when we look at the revenue associated with each product type, we get that consistent illustration?
In our work with Alvarez and Marcel, they're advising us on the transaction. We're actually we're going to be using the city's fiscal impact model to do the fiscal impact analysis. So that will be a standard tool that we can use to compare the projects against each other.
To add to that, in an effort to avoid inconsistencies like you're referring to, we're going to be providing a template, a table, which is essentially the input sheet that the city uses for its fiscal impact analysis so that they can fill in all of those details. And of course, we'll tick and tack and make sure that everything aligns with what we see in the pro forma, but they will be providing that data to us in a consistent format that we can then plug right into the existing model.
A couple of the questions. I don't see any mention in here about, and maybe this is part of the evaluation we have to read between the lines, in terms of connectivity to Metro. One of the challenges we have is that there's a parking lot and a building between our site and a parking garage and Metro. I want to make sure that through this process, especially for the RFDP, that there is some discussion over that. And then second, but probably more important, is related to what I would call kind of the exceptional nature of what we expect to see in the vision of the site. And innovation, so to speak. We talk a lot about making sure that these aren't your typical, plain vanilla mixed-use project, that there is innovation and an exceptional consideration and design and positioning and vision of this project, and I want to make sure that doesn't get lost in this RFDP. And then finally, one of the things that I have not seen a response to, I don't know that I'd addressed this prior to the initial conceptual RFP being issued, was the discussion over the exemption and credit of assessed value if it's a ground lease from an exempt entity to a private entity. There's some state law that exists out there that if there's a ground lease from an exempt entity to a non-exempt entity, that after 50 years on a ground lease, there's a step up in terms of the property tax that's exempt on that site. And I want to make sure that we've contemplated that either through a pilot or some other means so we don't get stuck losing money on this deal.
I apologize if I didn't get something out on that, but I will do that shortly
Okay.
because I have rounded up sort of the background information on that, as well as having exemptions and things like that. So I'll get something out shortly.
I think it's important too, just for the sake of evaluating the financial prospects of each one of these, because if there are developers that are underwriting that assumption that their property taxes are going to decline after a certain period of time because it's a ground lease, that totally changes the economics from our perspective as well as the developer. And so for us to drill down and make sure that we have that apples to apples comparison, we've got to get a firm answer on that before we go any further in terms of the way that the deal is transacted or structured.
Okay, other questions, comments? Mr. Z?
As I understand it, the ESC is planning a panel later this month on two topics, green infrastructure and renewable / on-site production of power. So this might go to what, in some ways, a part of what Mr. Luckenhaus was trying to express with some innovation kind of points. So I don't know how to get that in there either, but there ought to be some sort of mechanism where we consider that, tsunami effect of something that we hadn't considered before that gets introduced, and awaiting to that as well, which is, again, admittedly a little bit difficult, but, what if the mayor's right, that Amazon wants to put its brain trust on the site? Then what do we do? What's the valuation for that? I think that's how we have to think about that.
So let me ask a question or two. In terms of actually, for example, like phasing is important, right? So we don't want to get all the residential up front and hope that the commercial turns up later on. Are we asking them to come up with a phasing plan and committing to a phasing plan? Are there timetables for that, or is it just this is 1, 2, 3, 4, or is it, hey, in 2 years I'm going to do this, 2 years I'm going to do this? How do we address phasing, or how would you suggest we address phasing?
One short answer is that it's going to depend on what we see in the proposals that we've gotten to the RFP. If we see that many of them have proposed a single phase, then we would approach the RFDP differently than if they've come back with 2 or 3 phases. So we'd like to maybe punt on that one for this week at least until we're able to dig into what they've actually brought for their conceptual proposals, and then think a bit more thoughtfully about how we would like that to function in the future.
Okay. And as a preview to what we're going to talk about in a couple minutes, does that inform what they proposed, what our zoning wants to be there? In other words, to try to address what people want to do there, it may be a little different than what we're thinking to do there, right? So, I mean, I know we haven't got to that part of the discussion yet. We're talking about B2 with some kind of modification. But depending on what has been proposed in these initial tranche of proposals, we may want to alter the proposed zoning there, right? It may be that we've talked about different height or different density or something like that. I don't know if Mr. Shields, you want to comment on that?
I think that's another topic where let's see what the market tells us in the 6 proposals, and if that causes us to rethink our zoning, then we'll need to do that. But I think that is getting us into a segue into the next discussion as well.
Sure. Does anyone have any other comments, or is that the perfect segue into the next? Anything else? All right. Why don't we go on and speak to zoning and land use and entitlements.
We'll do a kind of a change here, and thank you, Ms. Boss, Mr. Richard.
Thank you all very much.
And Susan Bell and Carly will now help us through the zoning proposal.
And everyone's leaving.
And
Don't take any offense. Half a council just left, but don't take it personally. The Cheetos call.
and Ms. McCoskey, if you can join us too, 'cause you're
She's
very
leaving.
important for this whole discussion. Maybe I'll just say a word or two by way of introduction, and then I'll turn it over to, am I turning over to Ms. Bell? Okay. So, as the council will recall, on January 22nd, you enacted an amendment to the comp plan, which really sets the groundwork for the rezoning that we'll talk about in just a moment. Also on January 16th at work session, you talked about a proposal for B2 zoning for the site, but it was sort of a B2 enhanced. It was a flexible B2 that is really geared specifically for this 10-acre site. And we'll talk about how we do that by having it applying only to the Special District for Education and Economic Development, which the 10 acres has been designated in the comprehensive plan. And there's kind of one concept that's in this special exception that I'll mention briefly, and then we'll go into the details. What we're proposing is that the developers, once we've picked the top-ranked developer, they would go through an entitlement process that is what we would call a special exception entitlement. And that would lock in what the densities, what the uses, what the basic concept plan is for the site. And it's important that that be done before or at least simultaneously with the comprehensive agreement that sets the transaction value for the land. That'll be very important for them and for the city. And it's intended that that special exception entitlement would then usurp or trump the B2 zoning. And really then the zoning is conditional. It's really for what they've proposed. And if they want to change what they proposed, they'd come back to have a new entitlement. So that's one feature of it. And then the second feature of it is that there would be a special exception site plan, which also would come to City Council. And that's new and that's different. And I think it's worthy of discussion of whether that's necessary. It's proposed here for the simple fact that the community and the City Council will have about 6 months from picking your top-ranked developer to doing that first step special exception entitlement. And that's going to be pretty pressure-packed. Now, it may be that we'll get enough detail and enough things that laid out that the council would be comfortable saying that's the only entitlement that we need to be involved in. After that, the Planning Commission go through normal site plan. But in sort of looking ahead to how busy and how kind of freighted that time will be, that 6-month period of time for the City Council, as well as the fact that the developer's not going to be able to take possession of the property for another 2 years, that there probably ought to be some flexibility. And so that's the reason why we're proposing this 2-step process of first council voting on the entitlements, and then nested in that would be a later vote, possibly 2 years later, where the council, after recommendation by the Planning Commission, would also approve the site plan. The Planning Commission is aware of this. This was discussed back in January, and we've also really done outreach so that the Planning Commission is thinking about this right now, but they'll have an opinion on this as well. We want their opinion on this, obviously, but we wanted to come to council first just to talk about this sort of in the overarching principles, make sure we're on right track, and then go from there. So with that introduction, let me turn it over.
Wyatt, could I just note,
Yeah.
I think the other reason for doing that was at one point we had a draft which had this 2-step special exception process and left the site plan for later. And there was some concern that instead of making a neat pathway to this approval, we were just lengthening everything so they would have 3 steps ultimately to get the site plan. And that was another reason for combining the two, was to keep it to a 2-step process for the developer.
Thank you and good evening. I'm going to go into a little more detail than the manager just did about a couple aspects of this and talk specifically about the process that would be undertaken, because I think that's probably of considerable interest. There are 2 main components to this proposed amendment to B2. The first is a change in the by right uses to allow elementary and secondary schools up to a height of 7 stories as a by right use. And then the second, of course, is the element that the manager just discussed, which is the new special exception provision for sites in this district that are designated for the Special Revitalization District for Education and Economic Development, and also noted for mixed use in their designation. The proposed amendment would allow additional height and also considerable additional density, although density is not specifically regulated. There are a number of standards that will be used in approving this, most notably the comp plan and the amendments that you adopted back in January of this year. Some of the key aspects of the amendment begin on line 176 of the report. I mentioned the future land use map designation. To be eligible for this proposed change, they would need to be on the, in the Special Revitalization District. Density has a specific, in that it's not specifically regulated, but it would be consistent with the guidance in the goals and strategies that you adopted in January. In terms of uses, the proposal allows for mixed use of office, retail, residential, hotel, with a desire for significant or considerable commercial development, which would be characterized as office, retail, and hotel. And then where residential uses contribute significant positive net cash flow to the city, build community, and help achieve the goals and strategies of this designation, residential would be permitted. Looking at building heights, the proposal has varied heights as part of the recommendation, with compatible heights adjacent to the school buildings, and then higher heights at the commercial properties or closest to the commercial properties and the major arterials. Penthouses would not be included in the height calculation, and we have capped it in this proposal at 15 stories overall. In terms of parking, we did, as you recall, amend the zoning ordinance for office parking and retail parking a couple of years ago. We are suggesting in this amendment, however, that to promote multimodal access to the entire site, that full access to the various provisions that we had in the ordinance for office be expanded to include all of the uses proposed for this site. So that would be everything from reduced parking to shared parking to off-site parking, and for an exemplary TDM going below the actual minimums that are in the ordinance today. As Wyatt mentioned, there's a 2-step review process in this current proposal, and within the report, it begins on line 204. It's line 415 of the zoning ordinance amendment if you prefer to look at the more technical language. The special exception entitlement is the first component. It's the high-level approval which would result in a general plan for the entire site or part of the site. It covers your building massing, the heights, the location of buildings, density, the land uses that are being proposed by the applicant, transportation network for both pedestrians and vehicles, public facilities, and infrastructure. So it is the wireframe and the beginning of loading all of the various essential elements for what would occur on this property. As Wyatt also mentioned, the timeline for this would be submission following approval of the exclusive rights agreement, and then it would be within the 6 or 7 months getting to the comprehensive agreement that this plan would go under review. The idea or the intent of this plan is to guide future site plan approvals for the site. It could be approved for all or a portion of the 10-acre site. And the standard for approval by the council would be based on a finding that the project substantially achieves the goals of the Special Revitalization District, the comprehensive plan, and relevant site-specific studies. There would, of course, be potential for conditions of approval. Staff and the Planning Commission would be doing their reviews, as well as any other relevant boards and commissions to which you would refer it. And ultimately, the entitlement, or this would establish the legal entitlements for the approved elements. They run with the land, and they would be used for review of any future site plan, or special exception site plan. It would supplant the underlying B2 zoning. There is a provision that would allow for interim uses of the site, although very little of the site would probably be available for interim uses. With the approval of the special exception entitlement, at the appropriate time, the developer team could come forward to seek approval of the second step, which is the special exception site plan, and that begins on line 224 of the report, or 506 in the ordinance amendment itself. Now, this is a typical process in that it will be similar to the site plan approval process that you experience today and the commission typically approves. The elements that are approved in the SEE, the special exception entitlement, however, would not be subject to modification or reversal in this site plan approval unless the applicant seeks an amendment to those elements. This would be required, the site plan approval would be required before any construction would occur, so there would be protections there. But the intent is to result in a plan that is equivalent to your site plan that you see today. So the architectural details and other elements that you're familiar with would be a part of this stage of the approval. As proposed, council would make the approval or denial based on recommendations from staff and the boards and commissions and the considerations that are currently used by the Planning Commission in approving a site plan, which includes consistency with the comp plan, the future land use plan map, the impact on existing and proposed utilities, pedestrian features, and an array of other activities. There would also be a phasing plan included in this, both the uses and their timing for when they are proposed to come online, which is extremely important for the integrity of the overall process. Council could also apply additional requirements in the form of conditions and can modify other zoning ordinance provisions as appropriate if you believe that it would better achieve the goals and strategies of the Special Revitalization District. Considerable information that is always provided in the site plan would be provided at this stage, and the review process would be the first reading, referral to appropriate boards and commissions, and then a return back to council for action. And I think that concludes my remarks. Carly, you have anything? We're open for questions.
All right, any questions, comments, Ms. Hardy?
Great, thank you. There's a lot of new acronyms and process steps in this, and I feel like we're kind of used to the special exception process, but I know that this is a little different, requires an additional step. Could you overlay kind of what you just talked about, that step, with the timeline and the process we've outlined for that kind of this fall when we expect to get responses and choose
Sure.
kind of, and through next spring, I guess, which is the 6 months?
Right. The way we would envision this SEE, or special exception entitlement, to occur is that it would follow on the exclusive rights agreement.
Which is what's negotiated with the person that we select.
Correct.
Okay.
So that agreement happens in October.
Yeah.
This could be filed as soon after that agreement as it's ready to go. And then it needs to be worked through the community process, the staff review, commission and board process, your process, so that it is aligned with and ready to go when the comprehensive agreement is ready to go, because they have to lock together, they have to work together. And so we'll be looking at the proposals as they become public to make sure that nothing in here is inconsistent with the direction that you might need to go.
Okay, so that what happens after that? So the SE is filed when the ERA is done with the final bidder, October 2018.
That's as soonest that it could be filed.
Okay.
It needs to be completed by May of 2019, when that comprehensive agreement is scheduled to be finalized. And then at the appropriate point in the timing afterwards, those site plan approvals can be filed. The special exception site plan is the term that we're using for this. And the reason I say at the appropriate time is there's a period of time when the property is not even available for them to develop. They can seek to gain their approvals, but they can't act on them. So The special exception site plan element can happen anytime the developer is ready to bring it forward once the comprehensive agreement is signed.
And is council reviewing this new special exception site plan, or is it also still a planning commission function?
The way that this is proposed, the final approval would be given by council.
Got a question or two for you. So this approval would essentially almost be like a chart. Initially, you've got 482 apartment unit, multifamily unit density. You've got blankety blank 1,000 square feet of office, blankety blank hotel units, right? Is that sort of what you're envisioning?
There
Kind
certainly
of,
would be a summary chart that would detail out all of those components, but there'd be a great deal more information in terms of infrastructure, parking.
so that would be part of,
At that higher level, those things need to be known and understood because those pieces have to interact with the development program, and some of them are part of the development program.
so you,
Include the heights too. So you would have the
Heights and
sort of,
locations.
it's envisioned to be somewhat akin to the PDSP.
gotcha. So, and also, how about phasing? Would you envision?
Yes, phasing is actually a part of it. If, let me get you to the right line in the text. Let's see. On line 490, we are asking within the special exception entitlement plan for a proposed phasing plan, both the timing of construction as well as the uses that would come online in each of the phases. So you would have a handle on how they expect the program to proceed over what period of time, in what order. And we have a particular notation about parking being provided appropriate to the phase as well.
Other comments, questions? All right.
So I know it's new to us, but it's, given that you mentioned that it's similar to Arlington's PDSP process, do we have a sense of how the market's viewing this? Like, are they prepared to go through this process? Does it make sense to them? My main concern is making sure it's not a barrier to entry for people to proceed, that if it's different than what they've experienced at Falls Church or seems cumbersome in any way.
Well, I think at one point an early draft was circulated to some of the attorneys who have done a lot of the land use in, but
In
you
both
all.
communi- We
done
did
that.
circulate it to several land use attorneys that do work in Arlington and Fairfax, as well as the city. And they were the ones who particularly were concerned about 3 phases versus 2, because they know the current process. And we have not circulated this current draft with them as of yet.
And that's another thing that we will be looking at in connection with when we're able to look through the proposals and see how this would fit with what people are proposing, and there could be tweaks or something like that. But I think we're, if council, I think the idea was to maybe get something out soon to some people if council's sort of okay with the idea.
Lichtenhouse?
I just want to be clear because there was some concern and questions related to changing this to B2 and what was allowed by right. The way that I understand it, and I think that this is illustrated in lines 206 to 214, but I guess if somebody could just answer this is, I guess, a yes or no for me. With this new special exception entitlement process, what we are essentially saying is that even though we're changing it to B2 and it's got the education piece, in order to build anything, you still have to go through a special exception, which you are then bound to, correct? There's no falling back on the by right of B2 in any regard.
On the mixed-use site, once the entitlement plan is approved, the special exception entitlement is approved, your by right uses are only any interim use you might request in conjunction with that. You give up your rights to B2 by right as it exists
And
today.
Sorry, go ahead, Carol.
So the way it is set up, once a property owner or someone who controls property chooses to go through this process, once they get their approval for their entitlement plan, then that governs every use on the property, and so they wouldn't have the B2. Now, the way we would, in this circumstance, the way the city would control its property is we would make sure that or concurrently with approval of the comprehensive agreement or the ground lease, there would be this approval of an entitlement plan so that we would know that our property wouldn't, in the future beyond that, have any uses that weren't allowed in the entitlement plan. But in general, a property owner, which no one else has this designation, but if someone else had this designation on it, other properties within the designation would have those by right uses until such time as they chose to go through the entitlement plan.
Okay, let me just ask this one other way. In this scenario, we down select, we get to somebody that we think has a great vision, great product that checks all the boxes, we like it, we say go, we start working through the transaction, we've changed it to B2, they now have control over the property, and I use air quotes control because I know there's a lot of moving pieces here. Could at any point, once we have put ink to paper, somebody say, sorry, it was a great plan, things have changed, we're just going to go back to our by right, there's nothing you can do about it, I'm just going to put a whole bunch of warehouses there?
Well, I think that's in how we set up our arrangements, so that the ground lease and the approval of the entitlement plan happen at the same time. And therefore, they have an approved entitlement plan, at which point they have no more by right uses before or at the same time as they get any control of the property.
So by going through this process, a 3-step changing to B2, there is zero risk of someone getting control of the land and then going back and saying, I'm just going to sit with the by right use for now and develop that until sometime I deem it fit to deliver to market something else.
Well, I would say that's risk that's going to be fully managed as we move through this process. And I think yes, ultimately that risk does not have to happen because the city does not have to turn over its property until such time as that risk has been managed.
Is there a limit to the time of that interim use, or is that just dependent on the exclusive rights agreement? Or whatever we negotiate?
That would depend on the special exception entitlement that was approved. The interim uses would be, we would know through that process what uses they thought they could make of the property in the interim and when they would be. So that could all be governed by approval of the special exception entitlement.
So not just the type of uses, but the duration of interim?
You could include that, yes.
Other questions?
Just one other question. Through the special exception process, is the 15-story height limit still a limit even though we're going through a special exception process? Meaning if somebody came through and said, we're bringing an Amazon HQ2 or some spin-off of that, we need to do 25-story office building. Are we limiting ourselves?
Right now, the ordinance has an ultimate height of maximum of 15 stories, but council has the option to modify zoning ordinance provisions, which this would be one, for, if it feels that that's the way to better achieve the goals and strategies. So if that was council's determination, I believe they would be able to do that.
Is there a reason that we wouldn't go ahead and head that off at the pass? I mean, it seems to me somewhat confusing that we go through a B2, even though we have this special exception, but there's still a 15-story height limit, but we're saying if you feel that you can deliver something else, come back and we'll make another amendment to the zoning process. It seems that we should be looking at this site as a bit of a blank slate, so to speak, and not put too many potential artificial boundaries on it.
And I think that is something that could certainly be considered as the proposals come through, and it doesn't have to have that limit. I think that was always done to sort of, in some ways, to signal to the market that we would like to have a good amount of height on one location. But I don't think that's sort of, I think the planners thought that was something to aim for, but that can certainly be changed. And it might be worth, again, looking at, as we see what the proposers have in their proposals and whether more will be useful or not.
I think that's just worth discussing because it seems to me kind of arbitrary to put 15 stories on a transit-oriented development next to Metro. I mean, maybe someone can't deliver more than 15, but it just seems a bit arbitrary that we're just kind of carrying that over. I mean, I would welcome comments from the rest of council and others on that, because that could be totally off base, but it just seems arbitrary.
I suspect the proposals will shed some light on that. I imagine they're coming to. By the way, just on the Amazon thing, I was really talking about greater Northern Virginia area. I think a couple metro stops away would still have.
I was hoping to get picked up in the news press that you were hoping Amazon HQ too would be coming to that site.
Yeah. No, Northern Virginia as a whole is what I was talking about. So anyway, Mr. Z.
Yeah, I was reading this, especially near the end, where, you know, after the review in lines 506 and onwards, it just basically says, well, you know, we've given you this framework here, but whatever council decides is going to work and what we approve is outweighs everything else that we told you up front. So I just take this as an orderly process for because we have zoning as opposed to, say, Houston or West Florida that doesn't have zoning, and they'll never have zoning. But we have zoning, and so this sets up the expectation that it kind of looks like a B2. You said, Susan, it's kind of a framework, and then from there we give all of the circumstances that we would look to have other things done. You know, I, for example, think that we're a little bit prescriptive with regard to talk about penthouses and how it has to be set up, and then, you know, further on I said, what we say is, regardless of everything else we said in the preceding 7 pages, you know, it's whatever council decides is right and prudent. Let me just ask, though, that, you know, in the staff report, beginning in, you know, line 89 and goes on through some goals and strategies, and they all look really admirable, but I don't see any of that ported in the backside. So is that, can you explain how someone reads this as a regulation or a regulatory instrument, says, well, I should have read the staff report and picked up something on line 124, and that's what I should have in here?
We didn't incorporate the goals in the actual ordinance language because they're contained in the comprehensive plan. Instead, we have a reference to consistent with or supporting the achievement of the goals in the comprehensive plan within the ordinance language. So but it gets you to the same place without actually repeating them in the text of the
Okay, and we have that reference in here as well? All right.
Yes, in several places, it talks about the standards of approval.
No, I'll take your word for it. It's just all that blue and underlining that confused me.
I know, it's hard to read after a while because of the lines, but it is in there.
I would say, just in my experience, the idea of kind of PDSP, which this is sort of loosely modeled after, I think is successful. People like having some certainty that I'm going to get X number of units, I'm going to get X number of square feet, and your bank gets much happier about things as well, and your investors. So I think there is a lot of good in the concept, so for whatever that's worth.
And the idea was to time that is the entitlement process with when we're expecting a payment in the beginning, so that the proposer knows they have something that they will rely on for the future approvals.
Okay, are there other questions or comments about this portion of our conversation tonight? If not, thank you for the fine work you all have done to date. It looks like we have one more topic for tonight's conversation, which I think is a budget amendment. Is that right, Mr. Shields?
That is correct, and I'm filling in for Ms. Bawa tonight just to do a quick walkthrough of this end of the year requested budget amendment. So this is for FY18. And we'll start at line 21 and maybe just take them in order. I'll try to go very briskly and then just see if there are any questions. First is an appropriation of $44,839 for the Falls Church Volunteer Fire Department. And this is for an EMS grant. You will recall one of those. We discussed one of those for the FY9 budget. We also have one FY18 to work as well. At item 2 is $54,000. As we're working on the City Hall project, we're putting in sprinklering. So the full building will be sprinkled. When we looked at the water line, which is a 4-inch water line which serves City Hall, it is completely occluded. It's got like plaque buildup in your arteries. And so the actual dimension of the pipe is about 1 inch. In order to provide the level of service, we want to replace that line completely. In order to pay for that, we have done surplus equipment sales of a lot of the old equipment in City Hall, and we have come up with the auctions and the revenues to pay for that.
Can you sell portions of the pipe?
The pipe
Souvenirs.
is not part of the sale. That's an interesting idea, though, actually.
Are we replacing that equipment as part of the CIP cost of City Hall?
Yes, and so all the stuff that we've sold is things that are just naturally being replaced as part of the City Hall project.
Don't we have a contingency built in the City Hall?
We do not. No. There is a contingency on the contractor side of $500,000, but in all of our whittling down of the budget, there is no contingency on the city side. So we've been dealing with sort of a whole host of things, and each time we figured out a way to solve it. This one is the only one we're coming to you with a request to solve it through the sale proceeds.
Can I buy an old Mustang?
That is an interesting question. That is not for sale.
I need another car.
You might have an old dump truck, like a 1980s version dump truck. The next item 3 is the $310,000 for the bond issuance costs. Those will be paid for through the bond proceeds.
So I had a question on that one, Wyatt.
Yes.
So when I read the staff report, it said that the baseline was $50,000, even though we knew that we were going to issue $20-some million of bonds.
That's right.
Do we, for the future year's budget, given that we're going to be issuing a lot more debt, are we accommodating a bigger bond issuance cost in our budget? Or are we just going to anticipate to pay for it out of the bond issuance?
There is. So where we had not budgeted for it, we did budget for it for the library. We budgeted for it in the high school project, but we did not budget for it in the City Hall project, if I believe that's correct. So that's the sort of the one exception.
So the 310 is for the
It's for sort of the
for
whole.
the City Hall.
It's if you kind of think of the cats and dogs in this bond issuance, there's the million for the public safety firearms range. There's vehicles that are being purchased in this bond issuance and things like that. So this is sort of the accumulation of those items.
I'm mainly concerned for going forward. Do we have it budgeted? Or are we going to have to do this again?
Going forward, we do have it budgeted.
Are we going to, does that mean we're going to be, we're taking payment out that we hadn't originally budgeted from the proceeds? Does that mean we're going to ultimately need to take out more debt than we initially thought?
Yeah, so these fees are typically amortized as part of the life of the bonds.
Right, but we're paying amounts that so we didn't think it was going to, I don't know, let me maybe clarify. Did we not think it was going to cost this much to issue this amount of debt? And because we're making up for what we did not budget for, we're taking it out of the money that we're borrowing, which means that we have less money that we're borrowing to pay for the stuff that we're borrowing for. Did I explain that? Does that make sense?
Let me.
I just want to make sure that we're not now
so you're
saying.
on the right track.
Okay.
So for the high school, as an example, the school board came to us and said the high school is going to cost $117 million. And we went to the voters and said we need $120 million. And the reason we did that is we knew we needed $3 million for the fees for the bond, and they would be part of the bond issuance. Similarly for the library, and the library board has corresponded with you on this multiple times. The budget for the library project was $8.4 million. We went to the voters for $8.7. Again, to have the fees to cover for the debt. So what this is the debt for the other for the things that haven't had that budget process. The largest one is the City Hall project, but there are the other projects that are in this issuance part of that as well.
Are we issuing more debt to cover the bond issuance costs, or are we going to have less? So we are issuing more debt, having smaller construction costs.
Item 37 is a use of capital reserves. This is the $10 million that's been set aside for the high school project. This year, we have allocated $400,000, and we're asking for an additional $50,000, and this is to pay specifically for the VDOT transportation, or the review that goes along with the rezoning of the property.
Can we get both a budget and then what we've spent on the campus consultants and the like?
Yes, I can send that out. So you'll have that prior to the action on this for your next meeting.
Just a question. Well, how are we off by $310,000?
You just didn't include it in, right? I mean, that's the bottom line, is that amount didn't get budgeted in.
I thought it was
Bond
just
issuance
yeah, but I
costs
thought it
were
was
not-
just the city hall piece of the bond issuance that we had not accounted for. Just seems like a huge swing just for the amount associated with city hall.
Well, the city hall issuance is 11 million.
I have a text from the CFO who's obviously watching this evening, and she noted that this is the way it's always done, where you pay for the bond fees with proceeds, and it's hard to budget that till you know the actual issuance amount. And so from practice, this has been standard, and then going forward, trying to make sure that it's also accounted for, like in the library referendum that Mr. Shields noted. The city hall is the largest one in this, but you do have the fire range and the vehicles and the million for the library A&E.
So it sounds like, though, the bottom line is we know there's issuance costs. Those are normally wrapped into the bond, issuance. It sounds like here, though, it wasn't budgeted, like that amount wasn't put in the right slot. So just a mistake happened. Is that sort of the bottom line of this?
That's the bottom line.
Okay. All right.
Item 5 is $60,000. This is an appropriation for the emergency repairs to the yard roof and for the signal poles at Hillwood and Annandale. This will be paid for through liability insurance claim reimbursement. Now, just as a note, this isn't the full cost. This is to put up some temporary poles to get us through a longer planning process, for which we'll put in real mast arms and get that whole intersection fixed.
When you say this is covered by liability insurance, whose liability?
It's just our basic VML insurance.
Yeah, this
That's
is our
casualty,
VML
though, right?
insurance, yeah.
It's casualty, not a
I
liability.
think casualty is the right word.
Word.
not
It's
liability.
okay. I'm just curious if somebody hit the pole, a car did, and we're charging his
This is
insurance
wind-
company.
So this is a wind damage.
That would be like a
Wind damage.
casualty then, I think.
Are these
You're the
those
expert on
orange temporary things, those orange poles?
Yeah, we're gonna get rid of the orange trailer and put in basically a concrete pole with cables. It'll be a low-cost solution to get us through probably 2 years for us to come up with. What we'll be looking for is Councilmember Snyder's help for some NVTA money to help us redo this intersection.
So it's going to go from flimsy to ugly before we actually replace it. So, I think Mr. Schneider ought to get busy quickly.
Are we
Trying to earn my pay, honest.
Are we going to, though, like the non-industrial look of the poles? Like some of our poles in the city are essentially like, I don't know what's aluminum or whatever it is.
This 60,000 won't. This 60,000 is going to get a pretty unattractive solution, but the long-term solution would be to put in the fluted
Carlisle or whatever, some
Yeah.
kind of, okay.
the-
And that is our goal in basically all our,
all of our commercial district intersections. Yeah.
okay.
Do we have to spend the 60,000 interim? Or can we just go straight to the one that we want?
Well, the problem with the one that we want is that it's going to take us probably 2 years to get the funding, get the engineering, get the procurement, all that type of thing.
And it
so
also is a-
that little trailer that's there, that's not a 2-year solution
Is it 2 years because of VDOT or is it because of us?
because of the funding streams.
It's,
I don't know what that means. So we're the funding
Because
streams.
of VDOT. Let's blame VDOT. Yeah.
That's the right answer.
or it could be, we got to get the funding from MBTA. There is procurement, and the preferred nice decorative poles also have a very large lead time. So in the near term, we need to get this intersection safe. The permanent solution portion that's related to just this one pole will pick up a little bit more insurance
payment. But then the rest of the intersection is outside of the wind damage, but we needed to do that intersection anyway because some of the other poles are vulnerable, and that needs the engineering work and time. It is several $100,000 to do this whole intersection.
Was that during a declared disaster by any chance?
Unfortunately not. So it's solely, there's no VDOM reimbursement from the state.
The wind damage from that didn't reach the thresholds for any kind of federal assistance. At line 50, as council will recall from the budget discussion, or from the third quarter financial report, our public safety budget is over budget by $110,000. We plan to pay for that through a contribution from our city attorney's office from vacancy savings, and a contribution from the executive department through vacancy savings as well. The community services fund.
Wyatt, going back to
Yes.
public safety. So if we expect increased calls for service, et cetera, going forward, do we feel good about that in the FY19 and beyond budgets?
Well, we discussed the reasons for that, and some of them are specific to us being closed here at City Hall, meaning they're spending more overtime for court. There's another feature to it, which is for those who've been on council for a number of years, 3+ years, you'll recall that the police department had come to the council multiple years to ask for additional staff. I proposed instead an overhire process where the police department is authorized at 32 uniform, and we are almost always right around 28 just because of normal turnover in staff. And so I had encouraged the chief to go ahead and recruit to get to 34, get 2 over your staffing, knowing that on average that means you'll probably be right at 32 where you're supposed to be. For the first year, we've had that basic overhire policy in effect for 3 years, and now for the first year, they've been successful, and they've actually overhired, and they've had 1 additional officer than what they typically would have. So they're at 33 instead of 32. So that is one reason for this as well, or that's part of the reason for this as well. I think the 3-year trend is that they are just, it's very hard to keep, there's just turnover, and it takes a full year to get someone through the academy and on the force. So they're usually under. Also, you will recall with the school budget that the school board requests an increase in the community services fund appropriation of $459,000. That's coming from their own funds in that community services fund, namely the daycare program. They were going to do that in FY19. They've asked to move that forward in FY18 so they can encumber that money and get that work done over the summer. So there's no impact to the general fund that's being paid for out of daycare fees.
Quick question on that. So what happens to the $400,000 that was budgeted for the 19 school budget?
It was reduced from the FY19 budget because they wanted to move it to FY18.
Okay. So the $400,000 that was approved through that for 19 is now just being moved to 18.
That's correct. They actually had a deduct for FY19 of the same amount with a request that be moved forward to FY18. So with respect to the capital improvements program, the $50,000 is part of the CIP, so I referenced that up at line 37. This is sort of a repeat. And then 54 is also in the CIP, so that's a repeat of item 2. And then the special transportation fund, there's some underspending on 2 projects, and we'd like to reallocate those. And the first is this is underspending on the Roosevelt Boulevard project. So $23,000 would go to the Envision Route 7 project through the NVTC. And the second item would be to fund $150,000 to fund improvements to pedestrian accessibility near Mount Daniel and on North Oak Street at Northwest Street.
So I had a question.
Actually, a reallocation of existing CIP funds.
So underspending is a good thing. And I think the projects on 85 through 92 from Northwest Street sound good. Does this supersede other things in the NTCQ?
I think that I would characterize these Mount Daniel Elementary School projects as a high priority for walkability to that school and for traffic calming on Northwest Street. So these projects have been out there for a while, and I think what staff did was they found an opportunity with some funds to try to get on that project.
These are also funds that have a limited use for allocation, and we had a previous Safe Routes to School project that didn't fully go forward because of not full consensus of the community as to what to do with that street. And we spent funding, and we will pay that funding, have to pay that funding back if we don't do this project. So this also gets important safety things, improvements on the street, and preserves us from paying back that federal money. And then the $23,000 is our share of the match for the DRPT TDM to do the next phase of Route 7.
Just being a Mount Daniel parent, I know that that intersection could use help, but the schools also discourage people getting to Mount Daniel other than school buses. So I don't know how many school kids, for example, you actually have walking in that intersection. You have parents who visit and volunteers who visit.
Past surveys, yes, and in working with the new school administration when Mount Daniel's done, and if there's safety, there's been some good dialogue about encouraging more walking. We also have a fair amount of pedestrians getting to the metro through that as well.
The reason I ask is I know there's other things in the NTCQ. There's also the Winter Hill intersection that I think had a lot of concerns, and several of us had actually gone and visited. I think it's intersection of Gundry and Annandale maybe, that we had done a first round of changes on, but they were hoping for walkability improvements, especially as residents of the new West Broad building were trying to cross to Big Chimney. So I don't know whether they would qualify for using this amount of money, but we have a lot of kind of walkability improvements across the city. And
Yes.
in general, I support these changes, but if there's a way to allocate, say, $50,000 to somewhere else and use $100,000 here,
You
that would
have
help
in your
more things.
FY19 budget $200,000 for NTC coming up, and then in FY20 the $600,000. So I think if you look at prioritization and what's come in the queue, the Safe Routes to School and this Mount Daniel piece is up there as well. It just hasn't gone through the traditional neighborhood traffic calming because we had a broader grant that was scaled back. Any less will preclude us from doing the engineering, the work that we need for ramping there, and also would increase your liability to still have to pay back the federal money that we've already done for PE on this project that we didn't proceed with.
So we have to use all $150,000 there in order to take advantage of the federal money.
So staff's recommendation is to proceed with this, but we do have obviously projects in the queue and the $200,000 that we'll be doing with NTC projects.
I'm determined to see this as a good thing. I understand the tree that Miss Hardy is barking up, and it's not a wrong one, but this project goes back to at least 2 public works directors ago when we, went door to door on Northwest Street and had an extensive process of trying to determine, what the neighbors there wanted to do. So I think my only ask there is let's just, recommunicate with those folks on Northwest Street and let them know, because literally it's been more than 5 years. And let them know that, we are moving the ball some on some of the things that we talked about way back when.
Yeah, this is responsive to the things there was consensus about. It still doesn't resolve the whole existing sidewalk.
Right, yeah,
future
well,
access, which would be
that's not,
a
that'll,
separate project.
that'll be harder to resolve than the Iranian nuclear deal. So let's just get the word out to the folks on Northwest Street that this is going forward, and at least some people will be happy about it, I think.
Okay, go ahead. One other question, just because we were having a side conversation about walkability to the schools. So we have to use this money at this site for walkability to Mount Daniel. I can tell you most of the kids are getting bused, and I know Ms. Hardy references nobody's walking to school at Mount Daniel. If it is, it's very few people. A ton of people walking to school through that intersection at Oak and Seton, close to where I live, which that intersection is horrendous in my opinion. There's no way, in any way whatsoever, to allocate some of this money to different intersections that would be more widely traversed. I'm just going to ask that again. I think it's already been answered, but there is no way we have to spend on an intersection where very few people are walking to school
Be
compared to other
glad to
schools.
go back and do another look before your next action on this, but a core amount of this has to be spent, or you will still have to pay back the federal money. And having an underspending on another project is allowing you to correct this without taking away from other
No, but I mean,
projects.
at that particular site is what I'm saying.
Yeah, this intersection has to be done, or you pay back the other federal money. There
Not
may
like
be-
general safe routes to school, it has to be that intersection, Oak and West?
Yes, because that was the original grant for which the PE was spent. Now, it may not be 100% of the 150,000, and could we do it for less? I'd have to go back and talk to our engineers to make sure we could do the scope at less money. But this intersection has to be the one in which we spend a fair amount of this 150,000. Otherwise, you still have to pay back the
Six
federal
years
money.
from now, something that you do tonight will redound to your benefit, and you'll think back and say, oh, yeah, that was a good
Just
thing.
wondering why we applied for the grant at
No,
that
just because you
intersection
asked
to
the
begin with
question,
and
it's
not
going to
another
cost more than it come back to council for
Interestingly,
more
we
money.
had a Safe Routes to School program and a plan, and originally doing all of that, there was a lot of interest in
Yeah.
that street and that work. The problem is the amount of the grant didn't allow us to do the full scope, and as we got into the design and the engineering, which we were spending the PE for, we couldn't reach community consensus, and so we basically gave most of the grant back, except for what was already spent, and you have 10 years to pay it, to do something there or pay it back, and as Mr. Duncan alluded to, we are darn near that point, hence the need for the budget amendment.
All right.
And I'd hate to pay it
Unbelievable.
back and not
All
get
right.
any intersection improvement.
All right, anything else on this item? If not, why don't we go to schedule, requests, et cetera? Any thoughts on the schedule or any council requests?
So the meeting, oh, sorry. So the meeting on the 29th is canceled, but that's when the working group on the RFDP is meeting, I see. Is that, that's just for that group though, right? That's not for the full council.
That is correct.
Okay, that's fine.
Vice Mayor Connolly?
I have a couple questions. One is, have we heard anything about the, from VDOT about removing the island on North Washington Street and Park Place?
We have had correspondence from VDOT on it, but it's been of the nature of, it has now been assigned to the correct person. But at any rate, VDOT, we are in communication with them, and we got confirmation actually just today that it's now in the right hands and will now be considered. The city, under my signature, did send a letter to VDOT confirming that this median cut and this waiver request was made at the city's instigation for public purposes, not private purposes.
Okay. That's good.
Are you done?
I have others, but
No? Well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
the NVTA grant that the city is applying for, there's a hearing on Thursday. Are there people planning to attend that hearing to testify? Anyone?
That's not normally done at NVTA
Not
meetings,
normally done.
I don't believe.
It's a
There is
public
hearing,
hearing.
and people are encouraged to attend.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I thought that the message we'd gotten was that that was not.
It is helpful to have some people there. It is not helpful to send a boatload of them.
Okay.
What's helpful in that case is to have a lot of written comments so they can get it all aggregated and really see the volume, and they're equally weighted whether you're in person or written comments. So when we did the bike share and had over 300 comments, there weren't 300 people speaking. They were mostly written comments. It's a balance of making sure the voice is heard and not inundating the MVTA members who will be sitting there that evening.
So do we feel like there's a need to track how many comments are going in to make sure we're getting the right balance? Or are we just leaving it up to MBTA to provide us with a list of who's commented once the comment period is over?
Well, that's what we would normally do. And,
Right.
You know, we've sent the impulse out to, and really through your work and leadership, I think with help from Carrie O'Danino. But so then they all go to the NVTA. We'll see who has contacted them. We have not necessarily been contacted by the people who have sent them in. I think probably some have, but I don't think all have.
So we won't get a report of who's contacted till Thursday night's meeting, or will we get, I don't expect us to do our own tracking, but it'd be nice to know who has actually sent in so that we can do some follow-up before the 20th if needed.
NVTA will, in my conversation with the executive director, will not have a summary at the May 10th public hearing because their public comment period goes through May 20th. They are hopeful, and we certainly encouraged everybody with your all's help to respond as close to May 10th so it gets rolled up. There will be a report out May 23rd to the PCAC meeting, which Mr. Duncan will be attending as your rep as they start looking at the applications. We have heard, through you all forwarding your responses and responses from to Carrie, we know people are submitting. We just haven't maintained a separate database because NVTA does that as part of all their application processes.
Okay, so I know of two. I do want to thank Carrie for the flyers she put together and the poster. I talked to a lot of people at the PTA event Saturday night who were into it and excited, but I don't know how to follow up to make sure they actually follow through. I see Mr. Anderson is still here, and I'm wondering if at your school board meeting you could ask the school board to submit a comment to the MVTA. Perhaps we should send the chair a note and ask as well to make sure that officially happens.
I do believe you all are being successful, and there's comments, and just from the informal comments I've received from Ms. Bachman. And I'll defer to Mr. Snyder if you have anything else to comment in terms of the public hearing attendance.
No, I think if one or two people were there to comment on it, it's probably a good thing, but you don't need any more than that. They do keep account of the written comments as well.
And as I've noted in my email back to those of you that have been coordinating the comments, we also need to encourage people to remember the core purpose and eligibility of the program to speak to congestion mitigation and multi-modes of transportation to encourage our walkability, as well as the safety of students and pedestrians to schools and metros. But don't forget the congestion mitigation, please.
Well, if they get to school safely walking, then they're not driving, right?
It needs to be regional congestion mitigation and multimodals for our NVTA regional funding.
Regional is what makes the hearts out and loud and sing.
But it is fundamentally congestion mitigation. I mean, that is the whole point.
Sure. Yeah.
I think because we've been talking to the schools a lot and the parents and the kids, what's being heard, because Monica was monitoring our eFocus and our website, is student safety. That is an important piece of it because we want them walking and not being in cars, but we need to remember the regional purpose of the grant funding.
Sorry to cut in, but so Mr. Snyder will be at that meeting Thursday night, right? And there's no need for me to go. My part would be at the PCAC meeting the next Wednesday, the 23rd, right?
From my perspective, yes. I need to split up council members to meetings.
Okay.
The Budget and Finance Committee should be meeting the third Friday of the month at 8 o'clock. Mr. Lichtenhouse, does that work for you next Friday?
I have what is on the agenda that was sent out. May 18th.
May 18th. Okay.
I will be there.
You have that?
Yes.
Okay. So if Ms. Bawa's still watching, May 18th works. And then there's a ESC trip to see the autonomous vehicle on Friday? The Ollie autonomous
Yes,
vehicle.
10:30,
Are you going to
isn't
talk
it?
about that?
10:30 to 12. No, go ahead.
I'm just wondering if people are going to that, or are you going
Quite a
to
few
that?
people going.
People going to
Yeah, I'm going to that. The city manager's going to that. We're going to have a representative from Don Byers' office attending.
Autonomous vehicle.
I want to drive blindfolded. That's just a.
Seriously, is there a carpool going?
Councilmember
Yeah.
Duncan, you can be the test case to see if it'll stop before it hits a pedestrian.
What a way to go. That's all I can say to that.
Anyway, I think I think it was broadcast and people have responded, so I think there are about 13, 14 people going. I think you're going, so it's a lot. Okay. Let's see, are you finished? City manager has Founder's Row, has that scheduled for the work session?
Tell us about
Meeting?
Founder's Row and Park and
That's
Lee.
probably an easier question to ask. Tell us about Founder's Row.
Actually, the schedule you handed out does not say that, but I'm happy to hear that. It says Park and Lee.
So we should move the 4th up to the 21st?
Yes, we were working to have that be a date for Founder's.
Okay.
Okay, anything else on counseling, or not counseling, scheduling?
I had one question. The toll money that's being collected from I-66 tolls, did I read somewhere that money, some of that money is going to feed into restoration of the 3 bus service between east and west?
Yes, in the MVTC applications that were just approved last week, and Mr. Schneider could speak to it more, the city had 2 applications and one was funded, and that is it.
Funding was to extend the T3 bus service to East Falls Church, was it?
So between east, I mean, talk
and
about,
West
let's talk about, good news. I mean, that was a big deal last year when people came to us and said they've cut the bus out, and so this is going to be restored as a result of the people who are courteously driving in from Loudon and paying $40 tolls. We appreciate that.
So there is one more step in the process that needs to be approved by the Commonwealth Transportation Board.
Okay.
But we do think it's appropriate to get publicity out about this really important step that's been made,
Great.
where the city council fought to get this money back.
Yeah.
And we're on track now to possibly having success. So what that will give us is bus service if you're on West Broad Street or Winter Hill.
All right. You don't have
direct
to
bus
walk up to
service
the intersection to catch a bus.
to the East Falls Church Metro
Right.
Station. So that be a very good thing.
Great.
Commonwealth Transportation Board takes its formal vote in June, and they're rely heavily on the MBTC recommendations, but that's when it'll be official.
Okay, anything else tonight?
Moves adjourned.
All right, let's do it. All right.
Is this evaluation board meeting Thursday?